Hello, and welcome back to Chapter 10. We are finishing up our last section, Section 5, which starts on page 231, and we're talking about the commercial uses and disclosures of PHI. So it starts off saying that protected health information is a valuable resource for commercial or money-making purposes. Because of the potential for unethical and even criminal uses and disclosures for financial gain, the privacy rule established requirements and prohibitions around marketing, fundraising, and the sale of PHI. So let's talk about those. All right, so marketing is defined as communication about a product or a service that encourages the recipient to purchase or use that product or service. Generally, the privacy rule requires that an individual's authorization be obtained prior to using his or her PHI for marketing. However, marketing has posed some difficulty since the privacy rule's inception because covered entities at times have classified a marketing activity as a healthcare operation, thus eliminating the need, in the covered entity's mind anyway, to obtain an individual's authorization. But HITECH clarifies that communications are considered to be marketing unless they're described as a health-related product or service, and there's a payment for the product or service provided or included in the benefit plan of the covered entity making the communication, including communications about participants in a health provider's or health plan's network, unless it describes replacements or enhancements of the health plan, unless it describes available health-related products or services that are of value, although not part of a benefit plan, or unless they are for treatment of the individual, or unless they are for case management or care coordination for the individual, or to direct or recommend alternative treatments, therapies, healthcare providers, or settings of care. Now, therefore, although communications just listed look like marketing, by definition they have been exempted. Rather, they are considered to be healthcare treatment or operations, and no authorization is required. Common communications that meet the definition of marketing but also do not require an authorization are face-to-face, anything happening face-to-face between the covered entity and the individual, concern a promotional gift of nominal value provided by the covered entity, and a covered entity must obtain patient authorization to send communications about non-health related products or services, or to give or sell the individual's PHI to third parties for covered entity marketing. However, concerns exist regarding the ability of covered entities to sell individuals' PHI so that third parties can market their own health-related products and services. It says under HITECH, the ability of the covered entities to categorize health-related communications as healthcare operations, which again it exempts it from the marketing requirements, is limited. If a covered entity is to make a communication in exchange for financial remuneration, that means they're going to get paid for it, then prior authorization is required before they make the communication. The exceptions include communications describing currently prescribed drugs and, per HITECH, refill reminders as long as the amount of remuneration received by the covered entity is reasonable. All right, dropping down to fundraising. Let's see, fundraising. Okay, here's our slide. For fundraising activities that benefit the covered entity, the Federal Register permits the covered entity to use or disclose to a business associate or an institutionally related foundation without authorization demographic information and dates of health care provided to an individual. The covered entity must inform individuals in its notice of privacy practices that protected health information may be used for this purpose. If a fundraising activity targets individuals based on diagnosis, for example, patients with kidney disease are targeted to raise funds for a new kidney dialysis center, then prior authorization is required. Per HITECH, fundraising communications that use or disclose PHI are healthcare operations and must clearly and conspicuously provide the recipient the opportunity to opt out of the communications. So this opt-out is considered a revocation of authorization. All right, let's go down to the sale of PHI. HITECH prohibits both covered entities and business associates from selling PHI without proper patient authorization. In the authorization, the patient must declare whether the recipient of the PHI can exchange it for further payment. Exceptions to this prohibition include public health and research data, treatment and healthcare operations, including the sale or a merger of a covered entity, a business associate pursuant to a BAA, an individual who is receiving a copy of his or her own PHI, and for other exchanges deemed by the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services to be permissible. It says under HITECH, disclosures are permitted in exchange for reasonable remuneration without patient authorization for other reasons including payment, accounting of disclosures, and as required by law. Now let's get into the minimum necessary requirements. It's going to be our last slide here. So the privacy rule introduced the standard of minimum necessary. This is a need to know filter that is applied to limit the access of a patient's PHI and limit the amount of PHI used, disclosed, and requested. Essentially, this means that healthcare providers and other covered entities must limit uses, disclosures, and requests to only the amount needed to accomplish the intended purpose, with individuals having access only to information to which they are entitled and that they need to conduct business. For example, for payment purposes, only the minimum amount of information that's necessary to substantiate a claim for payment should be disclosed. HIM professionals have always followed policies and procedures to release the minimum amount of information requested for the specific purpose, but the privacy rule reinforces this traditional practice. Now, with respect to individuals working for a covered entity, the minimum necessary standard must be carefully applied to the use of information by the workforce. For example, policies and procedures should identify persons or classes of persons working for the covered entity who need access to PHI to perform their duties. Now, in addition, categories of PHI that each person or class of persons can access and use should be identified. Now, there are certain circumstances where the minimum necessary requirement does not apply. So first of all, it does not apply to healthcare workers when we're talking about treatment. They can have access to whatever they need for that patient to treat them. So it does not apply to treatment. It also does not apply to the individual or to their personal representative. So if a patient comes in and they says, I want a copy of my full medical record, you're not going to necessarily try to talk them into, oh, well, let me just give you a copy of your history and physical and your discharge summary. No, they have a right to the entire record, so there's no need for minimum necessary there. Okay, pursuant to the individual's authorization, also to Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services for investigations, as required by law, and to meet other privacy rule compliance requirements. So those are all exceptions to minimum necessary. Now, TPO as a whole is not exempted, okay? So that's saying that just because we're saying it's part of TPO for a facility, we can't just give everybody information willy-nilly. Treatment is the only exemption to the minimum necessary, okay? Use and disclosure of PHI for payment and operation purposes have to still adhere to the minimum necessary requirement. Okay, so because minimum necessary has been somewhat unclear, depending on who's making the determination, HITECH has sought to provide clarification via guidance from the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. Clarification was still pending at this time. Now it says until a final determination was made, covered entities are to use a limited data set as a guideline for using or disclosing only the minimum necessary information. All right, now, you'll see there, again, talking about part of the final rule, the minimum necessary also began applying to your business associates. So previous to that, it did not apply to business associates. All right, so let's look at our check your understanding here for Section 10. All right, number 1, all communications that meet the definition of marketing require an authorization. That is false. Number 2, fundraising may not target an individual based on diagnosis without prior authorization. That is true. Sale of PHI as part of a merger is exempt from the authorization requirement. That is true. Minimum necessary requirement does not pertain to disclosures for payment purposes. That's false. We said treatment is the only one that is exempt from the minimum necessary requirement. And number 5, the minimum necessary amount of information needed by individuals to do their job can vary across the workforce. That is true. An HIM professional is going to have a totally different requirement for information on a patient than a nurse on the floor or someone in the quality department. So everybody's going to have different needs. Some may need more, some may need less. What about environmental services? Do they need any information about the specific patient other than maybe a diagnosis? Because, one, they're going into these rooms after patients are discharged and they're cleaning. So they do need to know some information. But you're never going to give an environmental services worker a copy of a patient's record for them to look through just to look through it. So again, minimum necessary applies to different individuals based on their job. All right, so that covers chapter 10. If you want to go through, at the end of chapter 10, it gives you an example, starting on 236 all the way through to 240. Gives you an example of a notice of privacy practice. And then you have an example of an authorization over on 241 that you can just look through just for your own amusement there. I'm not going to do a review of this chapter since I've lectured each section. So again, go back through your review questions and then just be familiar with each section, break them down. Sometimes that's the easiest way to learn these, especially some of these short ones. You can break them down, read through them, make sure you understand the concepts, and then you'll be ready for test next week. So if you have any questions or anything, feel free to email me or hit me up through GroupMe. Happy reading and happy studying.